Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Nathan Weinstein, and today, as always, I'm joined by a guy who's currently looking after his own baby great one, Brian Counter. How's it
Yeah,
going, Brian?
pretty good. Yeah, thanks for that. That's I guess, a new piece of our lore, I guess.
Yeah, big lore revelation in the
Yeah.
past few, I guess, months it's been. So you told me that you just played a little bit of Bloodborne. We're finally covering, so we promised Bloodborne when I mean, not that, to my like 10 followers when I announced this podcast, announced even seems too pretentious a word. When I, put up a stupid post saying that we started a podcast for some reason. One of the first things I promised was an episode on Bloodborne. And it's just, I guess it's taken us a while to get here. So I imagine this will be the first of many podcasts on Bloodborne, just as we did like four podcasts on Elden Ring, and we'll probably do more in the future. Who knows? But it's kind of exciting to be cracking into one. These are this is like one of the foundational games of, I mean, obviously for both of us, just in terms of our thought about games and our work on games, but also I feel like it's maybe the first game that I told you to play, if I'm remembering that right. How did that? Yeah, this was now years ago, but yeah, do you remember how that broke down exactly?
Yeah, so I think, when we first met, which I guess was 2021. I don't know if it was 2020 or 2021, whichever.
21.
21. I had played the Dark Souls games. I had played Sekiro, but because I didn't have a PS4 or any PlayStations at the time, other than I think like a PS2, I hadn't played Bloodborne. And when I found out, I think that you were working on this book, working on your book, Grant Us Eyes about Bloodborne, that's kind of what convinced me to like get a PS4 and start playing Bloodborne. And I think you actually even like gifted me the DLC or something. Like you sent me like a download, gift card or whatever, so I could play the DLC as well. So yeah, I mean, I've played through it. I think I'd say three or four times at this point, and I booted it up last night to play a little bit because I just reread your book to sort of prepare to talk today. And I'm pretty sure, because I hadn't played it in a while, I'm pretty sure I'm on the new game plus, just given like the items that I have, where I am, and what level I am. I was like level 100 something, so I think I'm in the middle of a new game plus somewhere. And I'll have I think some thoughts about that later, some like kind of realizations about just starting this game kind of in the middle, because it can be pretty baffling. But I mean, I guess before we start really jumping into it, when did you first play it? Do you want to talk a little bit about how you got into this game the first time?
Yeah, I don't have much of a memory of my first playthrough of Bloodborne. I mean, some of it's in the book, and I feel like now that's in the book, I've like let myself forget it. So I'm trying to sort of like have intentional amnesia about some things, just because I was sitting with that for so long. But um, I do remember the game like around hitting the Forbidden Forest, feeling like the game had completely elevated itself, and it sort of transcended whatever it was before then and became, an all-time great for me around the point when I made it to the bottom of the woods and found the celestial emissary, the alien creatures, before the big reveal of the aliens or the really the eldritch beings all over Yharnam. Just finding those strange little Martians at the bottom of the woods, was such a strange and unexpected, and dissonant experience that I felt like this game had a lot more going on than it initially seemed to.
I mean, to touch, maybe to just start, maybe I won't ask a question because I am going to ask you a few questions here, but maybe just to start, I want to just make a comment that I think at this point, I think I probably already would have said this, but now I feel more firmly that I think Bloodborne is now like probably my favorite of the From Software games. And something that we've sort of discussed before, I think even in some of our earliest episodes, is the kind of idea of like the confines of the work or like the narrowness or I think there's a kind of a vulgar way of thinking of a work being like really cohesive or really having a unity or something, and that's not exactly what I mean. I think it's more that um, in a very basic sense, it's precisely because Bloodborne is so aesthetically coherent that you can notice the disjunctions within it, whereas something like Elden Ring feels maybe like a big kind of compilation of a bunch of different areas. Like finding the celestial emissaries in Elden Ring wouldn't really mean that much, right? Because there's like fireplace and ice place and whatever, like almost in the more classic video game style of like the older games that we would have grown up with.
That's such a great point. Yeah, like it's precisely again, the sort of aesthetic consistency of Yharnam as a space and of Bloodborne as a game until the point you start to get the Eldritch phenomena surfacing more vividly. And that feels, it's really the moment when this is, I mean, many people have made this point, so it's like I don't want to belabor it myself, but like, there's a moment halfway through when Bloodborne becomes a sci-fi game essentially, whereas before it was a Victorian horror game. And that, the glimpse of the Martians was like the first glimpse of sci-fi or magic, or the first one that happened in a way that um, felt significant to the constitution of the world. And I talk about this a bit in the book, but there's this strange fact that like magic exists from the very beginning because you go to the hunter's dream, right? And the hunter's dream is clearly a magical place. It's essentially like it's a Dark Souls hub, and anyone familiar with the Soul series is familiar with it. It probably won't think twice about that location, but I mean, as I say in the book, like precisely that generic similarity kind of blinds us to what's going on with the Hunter's Dream. We kind of see it and think, okay, well, this is a Souls game, right? So I know it's going to have a hub. I know we can respawn. I know there's going to be weird pillars or weird trees in the distance, you know. So at least for me, that didn't have the force of revelation, and it didn't really change what I thought the rules of this sort of the aesthetic rules, and just the fictional rules of this universe were. I really thought it was going to be a gothic horror game, and it's seeing those aliens in the game world with their glowing magic spells, and in a way it's like just seeing magic in the game world, seeing a sort of these beings who can shoot light. That just felt so, again, so disjunctive with the aesthetic so far. And crucially, it was disjunctive in terms of like a weird beauty, that the way they're sort of luminescent felt again like a total aesthetic U-turn from the kind of dank, like sort of muddy, like grimy, dark, Gothic, Victorian sort of urban setting that we'd had so far.
Yeah, I mean, if there is, just to maybe backtrack to that term you use, revelation, if there is a revelation, it's kind of like a weird metatextual revelation of scarcity, right? And this is something you talk about. And I mean, this means a few different things, right? It means, again, I love that, you mentioned this in the book, and I know we've talked about this on the podcast too, but, there aren't a billion of each weapon. You can get like what, a couple each playthrough or something like that. And they're much
I
more
think it
valuable.
basically you can get one each playthrough. There
Okay.
are a few weapons, like I think like the Beast Claw you can get in the Chalice dungeons as well.
Yeah.
And you can weirdly buy multiple copies
Right.
of a weapon, I'm pretty sure, but in terms of finding it in the world, in most cases, there's just going to be one. Like, I'm pretty sure there's just one Ludwig's Holy Blade, for instance.
Yeah.
Uh, and then maybe you can sometimes you'll choose something as your starting weapon and you'll find that later on. I think the threaded cane and the axe and the whatever it is, the cleaver, those maybe can be found early on in Yharnam. But other than that, the rifle, like these different things, they're either you can purchase them or they're found in one particular place.
Yeah, and so I mean, one thing you say that I think, especially as like a player of Dark Souls first, or maybe even some players of Demon Souls first, versus coming to Bloodborne. I forget exactly how you word it, but you say something about how intertextuality hides Bloodborne's secret, right? So this thing where we would ex just like you would expect spiders, you would expect magic, right? We expect some degree of magic, but the way that magic starts becoming, apparent in Bloodborne is a surprise precisely because we can't walk around shooting spells off, and even when we do get I'm not sure if they're even classed as magic. The things that you need the arcane skill to do, they're magic adjacent, I guess. And even those are much less disposable than something like um, the kind of like spears that you can shoot off in Dark Souls, right? Which you can just keep doing. You can even get multiple, copies of the same spell and just stack them and have 50 of them or whatever. But uh, because you need to use, I think most of the time the bullets in Bloodborne, even that you can kind of barely use the magic. Um,
Yeah.
and so the economy of the game in that sense is, I mean, so here's something I've been thinking, and I think Bloodborne is, the more that I think of it, such a great venue for asking this question. Because I think in our introduction to the podcast, we kind of started talking about this. And it's something that's totally like slippery and really hard to articulate. And I do like really want to get closer to figuring out what I mean by this, but I do have a strong sense that, games are literary. And I think it's through this formal way of approaching like the narrative setup of Bloodborne that you show that, because um, you describe Ulysses at one point as being a fairly straightforward story, right? And it's the form of it that, the formal odyssey of style, or however you put it, that makes it, I don't know that you necessarily say this, but that makes it essentially literary, right? Like literary is a quality that something has that has to do with how its content is distributed formally rather than what that content is in the first place. So you can imagine, and I know there is like a game called like Call of Cthulhu or something like that, right? Which I haven't played, but I gather that it's like a survival horror game, and that to me feels like probably not a very literary game, even though I'm sure there are plenty of like literary references in it. Um, so maybe this is a good place to kind of like pose a first question if you want to say a little bit more about how a game might be literary due to this kind of self-effacing or obscure way that its narrative manifests through the player's interactions with it. And again, I'll also just double down and say this is doubly intriguing and doubly difficult when there are literary references or frameworks or inspirations for the game. Um, and so I don't know. I'd say that a lot of what you point out in the book about what makes Bloodborne a fascinating game, so the repetition, the dilation of time, the glitches, the narrowness of it as well, like I think Bloodborne is more literary than Elden Ring, for example, right? Elden Ring, a game that has way more lore, also allows Bloodborne to be a successful adaptation, if we can call it that, of an actual Lovecraftian world. Like even revisiting a text like Pickman's Model, which is very short, um, love Bloodborne feels to have some of that kind of like essence of what a literary fiction like this would have.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like I'm gonna give a pretty abstract, like impressionistic answer. So maybe this won't be that useful, or maybe you can help me clarify it, or sort of correct me as needed. But I do want to just backtrack really quickly also to your point about magic, just because it's a really great point. And um one thing I thought, I might try to do as we're talking about Bloodborne in this first Bloodborne episode is like to try to touch on a few things that didn't make it into the book. And I had a couple things in mind, maybe I'll get to them later, maybe I'll get to it in a future episode, but this is actually one that never occurred to me until now. And now I really wish that I had said something about magic because I love magic in Bloodborne. I think it's so cool. And part of again, like part of what makes it so awesome, frankly, is its scarcity and rarity. So this in a way is returning to that, same point that I've reiterated that we've discussed on this pod, but like the way in which things feel actually rare, that feels like when you get a magic spell, there are very few magic spells. It's like, wow, I got it, like this is pretty cool. Like what does this do? There's only like five or six or seven of them in the game. It's not like Elden Ring where you're finding a spell every dungeon, you know? And it just made me think of that's not the point I want to make because we've made that point before. What I want to say just is much simpler, which is that Bloodborne is maybe the only game I've played, the only action RPG, fantasy adjacent game where magic feels special. Like a mage I mean, I don't know much about fantasy tropes, but I would think, that like in fantasy worlds, I think the norm, it's in like whatever, Lord of the Rings or something. Aren't there like three wizards or something? There's like three people who can use magic in Lord of the Rings, and nobody else can. And that's like, you'd expect a sense of like, I don't know, a wizard is or a mage is like a like a Shakespeare like figure, it's some sort of kind of like a once in a generation type figure of arcane knowledge and learning, and it's one out of 1,000 people maybe might be a mage, but in a game a mage is more common than like I don't know, like a consultant. There was like as many, like a consultant in New York's in Manhattan. Like everybody is a mage in a game. Like everybody can use magic, even if the general population of the fictional world can't. Every character you interact with, every enemy has some kind of magical ability. So it's like there's like casting a spell in most fantasy games is utterly quotidian and utterly unremarkable. So what's cool about Bloodborne is the very act of casting a spell. Like the first spell you cast, like you have to hit a certain stat benchmark. You have to find the spell. It just feels like I'm actually wielding some arcane technique, that very few people know about. That's actually secret, right? That's actually rare. That's actually forbidden. It's again like this just really wonderful synergy between the kind of just like baseline game design of like how we allocate items, power-ups, whatever abilities, and the constitution of the fictional world. Like they just reinforce themselves and reinforce each other in such a satisfying way. I would imagine that statistically, I don't know how many people actually do an arcane build in Bloodborne. It's probably extremely rare. I've done one, but I would figure that most players, there's just a lot more you have to do and figure out to do to play as a mage. Um, so that's all. I mean, I'm kind of geeking out about that element of the game, but I do like. I actually feel like that's one of the really special things about Bloodborne. That actually maybe 1 in 1,000 Bloodborne players are mages. Um, Whereas I feel like your typical breakdown in a D&D type game or a Skyrim type game is like 1 in 3 players, 1 in 4 players. Um, so that's a really cool thing about the game. I just wanted to flag that Magic and Bloodborne is great. The question of literariness, I'm struggling to answer this, so I'm going to sort of just talk my way through it. I mean, I want to say first that I think both of us generally dislike literary references in games. And it feels partly because it feels like it's trying too hard, because it feels like a bid for sort of cultural seriousness that I don't think games need and should actually avoid in order to be serious. In order to become serious, we shouldn't try to convince people that we're serious. Um, but also, I think it's maybe because the way in which literary references are communicated or presented is through a kind of communication, right? It's going to be through language, through dialogue, characters quote or reference some novel or literary work, or we find traces of it in the game world, right? It's very rarely going to be a purely visual element of spatial design or environmental design. That would be kind of cool. Say you're playing a game, and suddenly you find a space that I'm kind of struggling to think of a recognizable space in a novel that could then be sort of manifested in a game. Maybe like the broom closet in Kafka's The Trial. Only those who've read, who know Kafka well, when they'll walk into they're walking through. I'm thinking like a game like Control could have done this. You're walking through an office building and you turn a corner and you see these two guys in a closet. And you're like, what the hell are those two guys doing in the closet? And the game makes no comment about it. There's no like, have you read the trial? It's just like dressed there purely as a visual echo or a visual reference. That would be pretty cool. I mean, it would be a bit gimmicky maybe, but it would be cooler than, characters quoting the trial, which is usually what you get. Um, and this is all to say that I think what makes Bloodborne literary, and in a way, I think I'm just paraphrasing you and your theory of the aesthetic and literariness, um, but I think what makes it literary is its silence. Is it's just total disinterest in communicating anything, and in telling you anything or explaining anything. that cultivates uh, just an incredibly immersive and engaged and attentive and sort of contemplative relationship to the game itself, to the work, that feels maybe it's like experientially analogous to what it feels like to read a book, to have this sort of silent, durational, contemplative experience of like intense absorption in a great literary work. So that's my initial stab at it, that it's something about silence, but I'm not sure where to go with that or what even that means. But I feel like you're the exactly the person who can make me less confused.
Well, I think, I mean, if yeah, I'm looking around too because I'm trying to think about how to connect this a little bit more specifically with literature. I think silence is a really good way to put it. There's also like a textural thing to it as well. So there's like you can use this metaphor of silence, but also maybe like the give or the feel of a space, specifically in a game, I think. But one thing that I think of is, I'm sure, I don't know, I assume you're probably the same way, right? Which is that all when I was growing up thinking about literature, like really learning about literature, loving to read, um, I have a major distinction in my head between like there are the stories, or the plots or the ways we could summarize classic works of fiction, and then there's the way those works of fiction feel. And I think that the summary of the thing and the way that it feels are like they can line up, and in good works of fiction they do, right? And good pieces of literature, the story lines up with the feeling. And I don't just mean simply my feeling like happy or sad as a reader. I mean something a lot more kind of intricate, right? Like the actual texture or the world or the space that you get into when you're reading something, which I know is really kind of abstract and uh, difficult to imagine, but I mean that to be like not a vague thing at all. It's a very precise thing, like it feels a certain way to read Ulysses, or it feels a certain way to read Proust. In a way that me telling you, oh, well, Proust is about this guy and all of his memories does not capture at all, right? So this gets like even extended out in another direction too, which is that I get way less excited when I hear that a plot of a novel is like something that has an epic scope or whatever. I actually almost think even when it's something that I know is great literature, I'm far less interested in that than in reading, about a novel that's a thousand pages long about some guy who's locked in a room the whole time or something. And I'm not sure really how to explain that, but like, you know, I, it almost makes me think, okay, like I'd rather even just thinking about Russian literature, I'd rather read, The Idiot by Dostoevsky, which is one of the maybe more narrow of his texts, right? Like some of them have so many characters, there's so much action, and The Idiot, I think, is a lot more, from what I can remember, is a lot more kind of uh, not silent, but quiet, solitary. Um, a lot more subtle in certain ways than some of his other stuff. I'd rather read that than maybe War and Peace, which I haven't read, but I know that War and Peace has like a ton of characters. There's a ton, there's the historical aspect, which everything has, but I think that's maybe a lot more foregrounded in War and Peace. So there's kind of like multiple disjunctions, and I think that in a really good work of specifically of literature, those things can line up. But in a game, I mean, I totally agree about literary references. Even the Kafka, allusion would be kind of annoying, because yes, you would have to like be able to get it. Um, and I think this will be an interesting question for when we do come back to talk about Kentucky Route Zero, because I think there's like a lot more of that going on, and I think it works in a different way. Um, but especially in kind of like an action game, references would just feel kind of stupid, Like if the references in Bloodborne were specifically, I mean, obviously they're inspired pretty heavily by Lovecraft, but if you found Cthulhu in it or something, that would be like kind of lame, That'd be pretty stupid.
Yeah.
Um, but I also think, something about like the repetition of the game, because I do want to anchor it a little bit more specifically in Bloodborne, and maybe we can see if you agree. Like, so I just fired it up last night. I was in that awful area where you get taken by one of those dudes with the evil Santa Claus with the bag who abducts you or whatever, kills you, and then you're in like the jail thing, right? Um, And what I ended up doing did not at all advance the story or the plot. I mean, which is already obscure in the game, right? The plot of the game is already is you can advance something in the plot and not know that you've done it. But I know that I didn't advance it at all. All I did was level up like 5 or 6 times or something like that. Just by kind of grinding, I guess, because I was partly trying to figure out where I was in the game and what I should be doing next. Um, but for me, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an analogy. For me, that action of repeatedly just doing the same thing over and over again and kind of like living in the space of the game like that is analogous to just like reading good prose or something, where I'm not really concerned about like the overall structure. I'm more kind of, it almost feels like I'm rereading a paragraph or a couple of pages a bunch of times, because games are so repetitive. You talk about this in your book, right? Like we die so many times and there's this weird thing that happens that is a total paradox of, we do certain things and we're not sure if our character understands that this is happening again, if the enemies understand it's happening again. We open a door and enemies just like don't seem to notice that we opened it or whatever, right? And so there is this kind of impossibility of that, and that's why it almost feels like the game when we do this kind of repetitive playing, the game is almost like skipping or stuttering or like we're rereading or something like that. Um, so I think like yeah, the literariness lives, not in the plot, for sure. Because in a certain light, it would be possible to say Elden Ring is, the just the eminently literary game because of this like magnificent scope and whatever. And that's obviously, as you know, that's not what I mean. It has to also be operative in those moments where we're like not doing anything at all related to the plot, and when we're just simply repeating the barest actions that are fun, that we find some pleasure in, that don't mean anything, that maybe have a little bit of plot to them in a different sense, right? Or a little bit of narrative to them, like, oh, I need to kill a few more of these guys so I can level up, right? That's like my little secret plot for myself within these moments that have nothing to do with the plot. And I do think that's like that's possible in a certain way with reading. I'm not really, I don't know, I don't want to get too much into a rabbit hole with this, but I wonder if any of that sort of makes sense to you at all, or if it squares with your experience of playing Bloodborne.
It totally does. And I have to say that what you just said, the feeling of reading the same paragraph over and over again, that's one of the best descriptions of what it feels like to play Bloodborne or Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls that I've ever heard. I think it gets a little bit different in some of the other games. It's a little bit different in Elden Ring. Um, but yeah, I kind of just want to pause on that for a second because there's something about it's not just the repetitive action of rereading the same paragraph, right? There are plenty of games that are repetitive where you're doing the same thing, you're grinding in an MMO, you're playing any Ubisoft game and just doing the same goddamn like Bandit Camp over and over and over again. But the thing is that in those games you do it unthinkingly, and in Souls and especially in a game like as refined and as narrow, to use your word, as Bloodborne, you're doing it like attentively and intentionally, and absorptively, even amid the repetition. And there are a few reasons for that. I think one is just because the way the games were structured you have to be intentional, and even down to like whether you choose to press R1 to use a light attack, like because I mean this gets into the nuts and bolts of the games, and I say a little bit about this in the book too, but it's also just kind of like common knowledge. Um, Souls games don't let you animation cancel, which means that if you press the button to swing for an attack, you're committed to that swing. You cannot cancel out of the swing and do something else. You don't maintain this kind of like fantastical degree of control that you do in other games like God of War. I think it works this way. At any point you can block, you can put up your block even as you're swinging. And Bloodborne, again, like you swing, that's a swing. That's a discrete choice you made, and you have to live with the consequences. And that's emblematic of the way choice, and action works at every level of the Souls games. So there's just an intentionality, right? There's a significance to the smallest decision you can make as a player, the smallest action you can perform as a player. But it's also, I think, about just how intentionally designed the spaces are, right? About the way in which the rebirth, the resurrection structure of the game requires you to constantly retrace the same places attentively. You know, the minute you stop being attentive is when you lose a bunch of blood vials because you just tried to run past the enemies and got hit with a stray shot or something. That's where frustration comes. It's not when you're taking your time and respecting and sort of attending to each enemy and each element of map placement. Um, and just as a contrast, like I'll keep it internal to the pod lore, since that's a new theme today. But I remember when we were going to fight Radahn together in Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree, and this is like I signed on to a character that I hadn't touched in like a year, to join you, and then it turned out that you were like I think you hadn't played in like 6 months or something as well. This is last spring or last winter. And then I've learned that you were like 50 levels ahead of me. So I was already at like level like 180 or something. And at that point, it's like pretty hard to gain level ups because you're so high. I was just in basic new game. I wasn't in new game plus. But there is that famous grinding spot at the Palace approach or Palace Ledge approach road, something like that. Whatever in the in Moog's underground area with all those juicy, chunky guy, little juicy little, whatever they are. They're like little elves or something, like little circular, like they're like little rotund elves. And Albinaurics, that's the Albinaurics, right? There's all these Albinaurics just hanging out. They're like sitting, then you can just slaughter them all. And you get a bunch of runes for that. So I would just like I started doing runs. It maybe took me 3 hours of just like clearing out all the Albinaurics. I never grind in Souls games ever. Um, but I was like, okay, I'm committed to the grind here, so I can, because I want to do this multiplayer, whatever, episode. And so I was just like, just putting on a podcast or putting on music and just mowing them down, and that was the kind of like I had the sword where you just shoot a giant like nuke blast of golden light, so I didn't even have to aim. I just would just fire it off, and then I would get all the souls and go back and respawn. And doing that, that's the epitome of a certain kind of repetitive gameplay, where it's repetitive and the repetition in a way is an affordance. It's a plus in certain cases, and I think for certain players, and that you can do it while only half paying attention. It's just like a way to kill time. It's like fiddling around or whatever. And so I think that kind of repetitive play has its place. There are some games that I love where you're just doing the same thing kind of thoughtlessly over and over again. But the key difference in Bloodborne is that you're not doing it thoughtlessly. You're doing the same thing over and over again, but each time it's almost like you're doing it for the first time, which is in a way how one, to get back to your original image or prompt, like when you're rereading a paragraph over and over again in an attempt to sort of understand it or elucidate it or unpack its various resonances, or trains of thought. You are in a way like each time you sort of force, or at least I do, I sort of force myself to read it again, like for the first time. I'm like, okay, let me really concentrate on each word and think about what each word means. I'm not going to pass over things to say, oh, okay, I know what this means. I know what this is. Like, you kind of have to do a memory wipe and then take it in and see what hits you. Um, sorry, that was a really long-winded answer, but I feel like that, like for me, that's the key distinction when it comes to what is literary repetitiveness, or literary recursivity in a game like Bloodborne.
Yeah, and now maybe one way to like kind of tighten this thread a little bit is that um to touch back on this idea of doubling, which you really nicely point out there's like a double hunt, which I think is a really nice intricate point you make, or that you make a lot of out of that point. But there's all these, I mean, even in what you just said, we there's something irrevocable about just even every movement we make in the game, and then there's also something irrevocable in a larger sense of um you kill an NPC, for example, and you can't go back and take it back. So there's a doubling in that sense. Um, and I would say too that that's something that, I mean, this is what makes writing about literature difficult, but also so compelling, is that doubleness is always there in literature too. I mean, when we like, so if we are close reading a paragraph by reading it over and over again, just like we're repeating actions, or repeating a run or whatever it might be in a game, a Souls game at least. We're taking that paragraph out of context and we're like just working with it and just kind of repeating it. But as you said, we're like repeating it anew sort of each time, right? Like we're repeating it in a new way. Not to mention we're maybe experiencing different things while we're doing it. And then, if we kind of zoom out and slot that back into the larger piece or whatever, like there's something that happens then too. Like there's a double rereading of the whole piece that sort of happens because we've now sat down and read this one paragraph, 100 times or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking of another kind of doubleness, or maybe this is partly what you're describing, but of course, when you're rereading a paragraph or when you're replaying the same, re-clearing the same room in Bloodborne, like it's not that you're actually seeing it for the first time. You're approaching it with accumulated knowledge, and part of what you're doing when you're rereading that paragraph over and over again is sort of testing it, measuring it, right, evaluating it in relationship to all the other times that you've read it. But in order to, it is kind of like is a sort of paradox or kind of like, I don't know, sort of is this the hermeneutic circle? I'm never sure what the hermeneutic circle is, but like, you're going into you're rereading it in order to have that, an authentic accumulative experience of rereading the paragraph, you have to approach it like it's an alien object in some sense.
Mhm.
That at once you're both approaching it within the context of what you know about it and also forcing yourself to see it as something totally different. Um, I'm thinking a little bit here too. When I compared this to seeing things something for the first time, Michael Clune's book Writing Against Time, where he is, a writer who comes up often on this podcast, but who he has this whole book about different ways in which like romantic art and then some modernist art tries to, or more simply modern art, modern literature tries to cultivate or simulate the experience of renewed perception or of seeing something and seeing it as if for the first time. But the as if is crucial. Like you're not actually escaping the fact that you've seen something before, and in fact, maybe the power or the beauty of the gesture or the sort of fulfillingness or productivity of this style of attention is precisely that we actually do come to it with prior knowledge, but it's the exercise of trying to see it, trying to work against that prior knowledge, that's so productive and so difficult. Um, this is getting a little bit abstract, but that's just to say, yeah, like, these kinds of maybe it's a cop out, but I think thinking about these fundamental, almost like existential sort of doublenesses or paradoxes. This is the sort of thought that a game like Bloodborne does inspire, and maybe that's also what makes it literary, is not that it gives us a thesis on paradox or a thesis on doubleness, right? It could not care less about that. Like Bloodborne cares about being spooky and having kick-ass action and cool levels, right? Like it's not like Bloodborne is not a dissertation, but that's precisely what makes it so generative of these kinds of discussions and these kind of thoughts is like how in being so thoroughly and rigorously committed to its own ideal, its own aesthetic ideal, and pursuing it with such like relentlessness, and precision, it's like one can't help but be inspired, and to think and just sort of into their own interpretations that could range anywhere. Whereas again, like if you have a game that's like, hey, I have so many ideas, like I'm a game that's full of ideas. I'm a smart game, you know. That will just like make me shut down. It'll make me treat the game like a dumbass, like it makes me want to play it like Call of Duty, you know. Um, uh,
Speed run it or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, there's something about the difference there too, right? That the work there needs to be some. I don't know what I'm trying. Again, it's hard not to just talk in abstraction, but like this sort of like the
Well,
player or the interpreter comes to it from just a fundamentally different place from where the work is operating.
something like Bloodborne too, the ideas that are there are ideas that you have to experience rather than ideas that you jump from one idea to the next one or something.
Yeah.
I mean, this is your part of your whole thesis, of course, is about like close reading games, right? And I think we're already touching on that. But I think that's part of, I mean, to go back to the question or the thought experiment of reading a paragraph over and over again. I do still think there's a way that whether we're really trying to do this or not, there is a way where you can read a paragraph and hear or read something new in it just kind of by accident. I mean, the best I or whatever, maybe an easier way to kind of think about this is with music. Like I definitely think especially because we repeat music more than any other kind of art form, I think, right? We listen to certain songs probably thousands of times throughout our lives, and that's possible because they take maybe 3 minutes to listen to or whatever. But I mean, I've had experiences where I've heard a song hundreds and hundreds of times, but many years into being very familiar with the song, I literally hear something that I hadn't heard before, time number 523 or whatever, whether that's a tone, a sound in it, like a kind of moment in it, or if it's lyrics, I mean that I guess counts as literature too. So um, I think that's part of what happens when we play a game like this, right? This is why it's not boring to continue grind, even whether we're grinding or not, whether we're trying to just get somewhere or not. I think that's part of what I mean, I would class that as literary. I don't know. I think maybe we should return to this because I do want to actually get to I have like another maybe bigger question for you that's about maybe some of the moves you're making in the book that I found really interesting this time around. If I can ask that. So in the chapter on wonder, which is, one of my favorite chapters, I'll s- maybe I'll just quote a little bit here. So you write, video game wonder is historical, and to even conceive of it, which is of course different from the irrecoverable experience of actually feeling it, often requires a rigorous act of scholarly imagination, akin to envisioning the awe evoked by the Renaissance's first achievements in perspective painting. And then I think just after that you write, game wonder thus depends in every case on an awareness of technical constraint. Um, so this comes back to, I think, the point you were drawing from with Clune, right? This idea of kind of like a work kind of anticipating or like pre-anticipating a as if first encounter with it. But I do have a question here about medium, and I think like the idea of medium or like cross-medial reading is something that we've touched on a lot. But you open the book by leaning on the critical and artistic aspect of negative form. And at that point in the book, it seems irrespective of medium, right? So you're kind of drawing on the history of modernism, modernist art, modernist criticism, or criticism of modernism, you know what I mean? And you talk about Ulysses, other works from the time. It doesn't necessarily seem to be super concerned with medium specificity at that point. Um, However, the chapter on wonder seems like a place where medium becomes much more important. And I just wonder, like, if you can say a little bit about that. So I'm thinking specifically about your many literary examples and how they're leveraged throughout the book somewhat neutrally, uh, and how this is different from the way you draw on developments in painting, for example, to explore this historical aspect of wonder. And it strikes me too, I guess the last thing I'll say is that it strikes me as especially important that a moment of feeling, like the feeling of wonder, is the place where this question of medium specificity seems to come a little bit more clearly into view.
Yeah, that's a great question and also a really good observation. You're totally right that in most cases, when I'm bringing up other art forms, I'm deploying those references or those comparisons pretty neutrally, partly because I'm just taking as a given the aesthetic sort of interest of the game medium. But this is a case where I was really trying to flesh out and identify something that felt pretty specific to games. And in that case, a comparison like the one to painting was useful just in that, it's a similarity, but partly it's like, you know, it's a what's the word? It's like, there's the exception that proves the rule. It's like the similarity that proves the difference, in that um the perspective example requires this like massive historical sort of division and change, in order to become perceptible. Whereas in a game, it's like every couple of years the game becomes obsolete and you no longer can experience the wonder you felt before. Um, And I think honestly, like it's such a great question, and I feel bad answering like with having such a lame answer, but it's just anecdotal, you know. Um, or rather, my answer is going to be just anecdotal because this was like Wonder was the first chapter that I basically thought of, a conceit of for this book. And it came out of this debate I had or not a debate, but just a conversation with a friend about, whether games are art and something that I totally take for granted in this book, as I think we should. But it's still a useful question to sort of consider in a quasi-rigorous way. And my answer then, this is back in like 2015 or something, before I'd even thought about writing seriously about games, was just that like I said, I don't know how to define whether games are art, but I can tell you one thing, like games evoke this sort of very, very serious feeling of wonder. And the fact that they can evoke that must make them works of art, because something about that feeling just felt so deep. It felt so reflective. It felt so rich and so ecstatic in its way, that we don't have ecstatic experiences very often. It's not like we go around having, or most people don't go around having them, with any regularity. And so the fact that you can get that from a game just out of this sort of like this sort of silent, again, contemplative moment of just awe of staring at a vista, or staring at some pattern of light in a game, like a pool of water or something. Um, that felt really distinctive and almost irrefutable. And then I was really struck to find that Stephen Poole quote, sometime later, years later, when I was reading his book Trigger Happy, about, he basically says the same thing. He says that video games, the most uh, important or significant or even distinctive feature of games, aesthetic feature of games, is their ability to evoke wonder. So in a way, like the whole chapter, whole essay, is just a commentary on that one line from Stephen Poole. It's like I'm trying to just really unpack what he means, and to specify as best I can, like, well, what is the feeling of wonder then that we feel in a game, and how is it different from the wonder we might feel when we're like out climbing a mountain or something, What's actually striking and what I return to again again and again in that chapter is the fact that it's so similar to the wonder we might feel when we're out, when we go to the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or something, and we see this incredible sort of massive natural vista, but of course it has this other element too. And so, I mean, TLDR, I guess, like the distinctive feature for me of video game wonder is precisely the combination of this kind of spatial mimetic awe, like a kind of amazement at the the nature of the object or space being represented, combined with a kind of technical or specialist or formalistic awe at the achievement of of the technical achievement of this game that allowed such a space to be generated, that allowed such a space to be traversable or to even appear in a video game. Um, and that combination of technical wonder with um, a kind of content or representational based wonder felt distinctive, although I don't think I should say, and here's another, sort of like a bit of an addendum to the book or something that I didn't sort of say in so many words explicitly in the book. I don't think it's only found in games because I think special effects in film, there is maybe a moment, at the sort of bleeding edge of CGI, or even with something like Star Wars in the 1970s and 80s, like where the convincing representation of something sublime and massive and sort of outlandish, or alien or new, that would also bring a kind of technical formalistic awe, I think, in some cases, similar to the amazement we feel when playing a game. And this is, I mean, I sort of mentioned it by way of a sort of small citation reference to, I think the literary critic is named Scott Bukatman, who has this book on special effects and the sort of aesthetics of special effects in film, like a very serious aesthetic, actually, like in the Kantian sense, I think, interpretation of special effects. Um, but for me, like one of his Bukatman's main points is that, um, when we feel wonder watching an incredible sequence or a special effects sequence in a film, or in any film media, um, part of its one of its distinctive features is that it sort of happens really fast, or that it like it's kinetic, it like it has a certain pace, a certain speed, and it has in a way like a certain density of stimulation, auditory visual stimulation for the viewer. Whereas again, like what's distinctive about Wonder in games, or what seems really notable at least, is how it's often very static and compl and slow. Like you stop to stare and you look and you sort of reflect, and you could just sort of stare and stand for a long time, looking out on some magnificent landscape. Whereas in a film, like you'll get, it's going to sort of speed you through these shots. It's going to be uh, involved or incorporated into an action scene or something, or into a set piece that's here, and it kind of hits you, kind of overwhelms you, hits you over the head, and then it's gone.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important. I think it's a much bigger question that we should definitely come back to because I think not progressing or like not moving on or remaining still in the face of wonder is a I don't know, I think that's a definitely an interesting case with games in a certain way. I do have
There are
maybe
times, I mean, it's like it just occurs to me, like there are times in games when you're in basically a Hollywood set piece, and a lot of stuff is happening. This happens in like Naughty Dog games. I remember one of the most wondrous moments of the last generation was there's a scene in The Last of Us Part 2 when you ride on a horse through a burning village. And I remember that experience just took my breath away. Like I was amazed that it was happening on my screen. I couldn't believe it.
Hmm.
But like part of that was again like that I wasn't being threatened. Like you're riding this horse, and it's precisely a moment where there's not much combat, or there's not like there's maybe a little bit of combat in that scene, but when you're on the horse, I think it's more of just like this moment of, in a way, you're in motion, but it's experientially kind of a pause because you're not really playing, you're kind of just watching. Um, so maybe there's a comparative or a differential aspect here too, that in a film where we're always just watching, when things, special effects kick in, oftentimes it feels like our pulse goes up and it's becoming more kinetic. It's a moment of incredible movement and energy. Whereas in a game like Uncharted, it's actually your pulse is going down, you're becoming a little bit more detached, you're a bit more of an observer and able to assume a kind of more reflective stance on the set piece, on the wondrous phenomenon, or environment, right, or scene, even if it's technically moving, it's technically a scene in motion. Um, but even that case seems a bit rare. Like it's really for me, it's those static moments, and that FromSoft has them just everywhere. Like where you just step out and can see this enormous view, a cityscape, or an ocean, or something like that. And that for me very often just involves stopping. And in fact, in the Uncharted example, or rather the Last of Us example, I wonder if part of me, in 2020, experiencing that for the first time, actually wished you could stop the horse and just wanted to look around. Like maybe that would have enhanced the feeling of wonder even more. I'm not sure that's an open question, but it's something to think about. It's something I need to think about.
Yeah, I definitely want to kind of bookmark that and come back to it in a further discussion, maybe even a further discussion of Bloodborne, because I think there's a lot more to say about that. Um, I do have one more question. It's kind of like an open, maybe kind of a fun, question that will invite anecdotes actually. But I really like the way you put this. In your intro, you talk about I think this is partly to justify, the kind of like negative form aspect of the book. So you say, even as I progress further and begin to fall under the game's spell, even when, as a literary scholar trained in modernism, I quickly warmed to the game's coldness and learned to appreciate its resolute disregard for the player's generic expectations, their comfort, even their pleasure. In short, even when the game's profound negative force in every aspect of its design began to seem like an artistic virtue, I still couldn't shake the feeling that some of the things I liked about the game were deep down nothing other than flaws masquerading as progressive violations of gaming convention. Um, so besides really enjoying the parallel structure of this long sentence, this kind of critical discernment is, I think, like really useful to point out and like really helpful for Um, I don't know, examining that kind of angle of the game from, or I guess examining a different angle of a game or any work of art, this kind of like, um, it's a different kind of as if, right? Or maybe it's a what if instead of an as if, right? Like, what if this was an accident, or what if this was, I mean, this is baked, kind of all throughout your work, this idea of bad writing or glitches or, technical mistakes in a game or whatever. Um, and then, I mean, so I have almost like a question that kind of maybe I'll ask you to think about almost the opposite of this, which is many times I take works that I like a lot, and not that I necessarily try to do this, but I'll notice things about them that I don't like or that don't work, yet they feel very intentional. And I know we've done this as well, talking about certain games on the podcast and elsewhere, but things that don't feel intentional, but that are precisely successful within the vision of the creator or author or artist or whatever, but they fail maybe for me. Almost like I have a different kind of understanding of the whole that doesn't really uh, that either doesn't work with the whole that I'm given, or I just disagree that that thing in question works with the whole that I'm given. So I was just wondering if you like think about this at all, because the more looking over your book again, there's a lot more kind of like metacritical stuff going on that I find really interesting. And so this like critical gesture that you set out here, but also the one that I'm kind of describing, which is almost the opposite. I wonder if that's something that happens for you a lot when you're playing games. Like do you tend to focus on those moments that seem disjunctive in a way that's like not critically productive quite as much?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the my obsession with aesthetic faults and the way in which they breed interpretation, or breed commentary, or rather just supercharge commentary, comes out of a sort of even more fundamental orientation towards faults and a kind of obsessiveness about things that bother me, right? That seem imperfect in works or things that I like the way you put it. That seem like it's not that there are mistakes because the author or artist clearly intended them, but I don't like what was intended. Um, that is an element of artistic failure, so to speak, that I don't really treat in Bloodborne. I don't know if there's anywhere where I just say, this thing just sucks, like I don't like this thing. Um, there are, I mean, like I think. Well, then let me circle back to Bloodborne. I would say that yes, I tend to just fixate on those things. And I'm actually playing right now. I was literally before this podcast, I stopped a stream of Metal Gear Solid Delta, which is the brand new re-release of Metal Gear Solid 3. And it's essentially a glorified remaster. Like they kept it's the same game, just with a new camera angle and redone in Unreal 5. Um, and so I keep noticing these things in the remaster that were there in the original that I obsessively played. I mean, Metal Gear Solid 3 was my OG favorite game. And so I know it front to back. I like know it. I truly know it by heart. And playing now, I'm struck, after having not played it for a long time, like my attention keeps catching at these things that as a teenager I used to be like, I don't think that worked. That's like I wish that wasn't in the game. Like that's kind of stupid. Or that just like even something as small as like a one way of a single line delivery, from one of the actors, or like something included in a shot, in a discrete sort of virtual shot from the virtual camera. I would just be like, why didn't they cut that out? Like that actually actively makes this scene worse. It makes this game worse. Um, so yeah, like I would say that I often have a hard time appreciating things, really. I try really hard to appreciate, to sort of have to train myself to appreciate things, especially things that I really care about when they have these kind of like nagging flaws that don't, maybe they aren't even instances of negative form. They're just like stuff that I don't, that just doesn't seem to work for me. Um, I think I said earlier with like total conviction that Bloodborne has that stuff too. Um, I'm now trying to recall some examples. To be honest, haven't played the game in like 3 years. I played a little bit of it I streamed a little bit last winter, but um, maybe I'll break the seal on one of my other bits that I didn't put into the book, but that, if I were to rewrite it, I might try to shoehorn in somewhere. This is just like one of those things. It is a kind of negative form, it's a bit more enigmatic, it's a bit more mysterious. So it's kind of more of a piece with the sort of things that I'm discussing in the book. But it still ultimately just feels like an artistic choice that I don't agree with, which is that unless I'm wrong or unless I'm just badly misreading an environmental texture or effect, have you noticed that there's this one area in Hemwick Charnel Lane? So like Hemwick Charnel Lane is like the kind of witches village. It's like very Resident Evil 4. Um and it's a kind of outskirt to Yarnum, a rural outskirt to Yarnum where you have to sort of weave through these like thatch sort of like village huts and then kind of like these sort of decrepit barns. But at one point, right near the end, you get to this valley and if you look down into the valley, it actually, so I'm going by memory here. I haven't checked this in a while, but I took a note of this when I was playing the game for the book, like kind of very deliberately and slowly playing the game. If you look down into the valley, you can see that it looks almost like the whole area is suspended in the air. That there's actually like a white void underneath Hemwick Charnel Lane that is explicitly being represented as such. So of course, there's something meta here, and again, this is the sort of thing that Souls does really well, is that all game levels are suspended in a void, more or less. You know, so actually what's unnatural or what needs to be faked is the idea that it would be assimilated into a continuous natural landscape. And Hemwick Charnel Lane, in a large part, it's like the one place in the game, or one of the few places where you can see Canehurst Castle, for instance. You can see Yarnum, you can see also the areas outside of Yarnum that are traversable within the game. You kind of get a panoramic view of the entirety of the region, not just of the city. But at the same time, you also have this one area where it kind of like reveals the truth of the game and this area itself, which is like you have this weird void, that's just very visible. Um, and so I just have always wondered, or since then I've wondered, like, what was the intentionality there? Like, couldn't you have at least like changed the filter a little bit so it just looked like a foggy valley, a misty valley? Like, why make it so clear that there's nothing down there, that in fact that this whole landscape is just floating out there in nothingness. Um, my thought for if I were to relate this to the book was this sort of it's a little bit like maybe convoluted or at least a little bit esoteric. I think for a game audience, definitely not for a literary audience. But I wanted to relate it to the Castle of Otranto, which is the first Gothic novel, where there's this funny thing where the Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole um, was sort of famed in its time, and even someone like Mikhail Bakhtin, writes about how vividly the castle setting crystallizes for the reader. It's like I feel like I'm in the castle. The castle is just like basically invented or at least popularized the trope of like the haunted castle as something interesting, as something full of narrative possibility. Um, but if you actually read the text, like the castle and the setting itself are essentially non-existent. And by that I just mean there's no physical description of the space. So all description of what's happening in the physical reality of the Castle of Otranto comes from the characters saying, "Hey, look at that thing over there." So character will be like, "Oh my God, there's a giant floating suit of armor." But there's no like narrator saying a huge floating suit of armor appear. Like or it's incredibly terse, incredibly cursory in the way that there's objective representation of the environment. So actually, the castle is something conjured out of dialogue and conjured out of a weird kind of pointing, rather than having a sort of like ontological solidity established by the neutral narrative voice. And what that leads to is this very like this strong feeling of immateriality when you're reading The Castle of Otranto. Um, I mean, on a basic level, this is because space is functioning as it does in theater and not as it does in a novel. It's what we now recognize according to novelistic convention. Space is being, in theater, space is also conjured. Someone goes, "Look at that," right? And you don't need to have like a special effect. We just have all the characters gaping, right, and pointing at something. But when it's happening in a book that you're reading, it is a weird effect, and it just makes it seem essentially like the castle is a void. The castle is like this infinite space of possibility where nothing is fixed, nothing is set, and anything can be conjured ex nihilo, like at any point in the action. Um, and so I thought, like, I had this sort of reading where this moment in Henwick Charnel Lane is like paying homage, I think clearly unintentional homage, but paying homage to the root of the Gothic genre by sort of playing on the idea that all space is really a void and that all environment is just this kind of space of pure possibility. And really, the designers are like, hey, we're just showing you that we can do anything with the space. So this is all imaginary space and we can fuck it up or we can add things as we want. But at the end of the day, it's really just it's an abyss of nothingness. Um, so that was my connection. I write about Frankenstein, I write about Dracula. I tried to play the hits, in this book, even though it's not super foregrounded. But, obviously Lovecraft is the central figure, but also Frankenstein and Dracula appear. Um, and I was going to bring in the Castle of Otranto, but I ended up just cutting that. Anyway, that's a very long, again, I'm being very long-winded today, but that's a somewhat lengthy answer to how I might justify, like artistically justify that choice. But at the end of the day, I want to say, having said all of that and having chosen not to write that chapter and include it, that I just don't like that choice. It just seems like it totally violates one of the things that makes Yharnam special, which is precisely that it feels so real, in contradistinction to the Nightmare Worlds. So we already have the Nightmare Realms. We have the Nightmare of Mensis, we have the Hunter's Nightmare, we have the Nightmare Frontier, and then we have the Hunter's Dream. We have areas that are very explicitly floating in voids, and where spatial rules are totally messed up, and that's what makes Yharnam feel special. And what makes, it makes Yharnam feel special because it's so grounded. It feels like such a real place with a kind of physical solidity and certainty. And on the flip side, it makes those nightmare realms feel special because they're so spatially disjunctive in contradistinction to the kind of main environment of the game. And this was a case where like the distinction is blurring and getting watered down, in a way that I find just like aesthetically deeply unsatisfying.
Yeah, that maybe might be a good place to end us off here. And I'll just say that the that connection, I mean, it just makes me think that that is actually a deeply literary point. Like if it is indeed pointing back to the imaginary nature of all these spaces and they're kind of conjuring up by some kind of act of creation, feels like a literary point, but also, maybe a critical point that we can come back to, and I'm sure we will even just accidentally come back to, which is the our tendency to always recuperate those things and connect them back to uh, you know, um, to more productive interpretive modes. But yeah, I think maybe, I'll end us off here just by reminding you, Nathan, especially when you're in the hunter's nightmare, to keep your magic hand lantern lit.
Will do, Brian.